Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we travel to a quiet suburb in Illinois, where a seemingly perfect family lived in a house overlooking a peaceful lake. This is a story of secrets, deception, and a tragedy that shook a small community to its core. Let the gentle rhythm of this narrative carry you into rest as we unfold the tale of the Coleman family. In the early 2000s, Columbia, Illinois was the kind of place where families felt safe. Children rode their bicycles down tree-lined streets, neighbors waved to each other from their driveways, and violent crime was something that happened somewhere else. Across the river in St. Louis, perhaps. But never here. On a quiet street called Robert Drive, in a subdivision known as Columbia Lakes, stood a two-story house with white siding and green shutters. It sat across from a small, serene lake, the kind of view that made people stop and appreciate the simple beauty of suburban life. Inside this house lived what many described as the perfect American family. Christopher Coleman was a man who seemed to have it all together. Born in 1977 in Chester, Illinois, Chris grew up as the son of a minister. His father, Ron Coleman, was a pastor, and faith had always been the foundation of the Coleman household. Chris was known in high school as a good student and a talented athlete, the kind of young man parents pointed to as an example. After graduating from Chester High School in 1995, he joined the United States Marine Corps, where he served as a military police officer and canine handler. It was during his time in the military at a canine training seminar at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, that Chris met Sherry Weiss. Sherry was also in the military, serving as an Air Force canine officer. She was pretty, with long dark hair and a warm smile. Friends described her as sweet, kind, and deeply committed to her Christian faith. The two young service members fell for each other quickly, their shared love of dogs and duty forming an instant connection. Their romance moved swiftly. After dating for only about 3 months, Chris and Sherry drove up to Chicago one weekend and got married. It was 1998, and Sherry was already expecting their first child. Their son Garrett was born on April 30th, 1998, and 2 years later, on January 25th, 2000, their second son Gavin joined the family. After leaving the military in 1999, Chris needed to find work that would support his growing family. Through his connections in the Christian community, he landed a position that seemed almost too good to be true. He became the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, a world-renowned evangelical organization based in Missouri. Joyce Meyer was one of the most recognizable faces in Christian television, her ministry reaching millions of viewers worldwide. As her security chief, Chris traveled extensively, protecting Joyce and her family, attending conferences, and earning a 6-figure salary. It was prestigious work, well-paying work, and it placed the Coleman family firmly in the comfortable middle class. They could afford their lakeside home, could provide for their boys, could live the American dream. By all outward appearances, the Colemans were thriving. Sherry had become a stay-at-home mother, dedicating herself to raising Garrett and Gavin. The boys attended Parkview Elementary School in Columbia, where they were well-liked and active. 11-year-old Garrett was energetic and loved playing football. 9-year-old Gavin was quieter, more thoughtful, and loved baseball. They were typical boys who enjoyed Legos, video games, and sleepovers with their friends. The family was active in their church community. Chris's background as a preacher's son meant that faith remained central to their lives. Neighbors in the Columbia Lakes subdivision described them as friendly and engaged. They were the kind of family you'd see walking their dog or playing catch in the front yard on a summer evening. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect life, something was beginning to crack. In November of 2008, Sherry Coleman began to notice changes in her husband. the subtle shifts that only a wife would perceive. Chris seemed distracted, distant. He was less interested in family activities, less present even when he was home. Their arguments became more frequent. Something felt off, though Sherry couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Around the same time, something strange began happening. Chris Coleman received a disturbing email at work. The message was crude and threatening, filled with profanity and venom. It warned Chris that if he didn't quit his job with Joyce Meyer Ministries, something terrible would happen to his family. The email came from an account with the address destroychris@google.com. The message read, "Tell Joyce to stop preaching the bullshit, or Chris's family will die." It was shocking, alarming, but in Chris's line of work, protecting a high-profile televangelist, he'd likely encountered hostile people before. Religious figures, especially those as wealthy and visible as Joyce Meyer, often attracted critics and even deranged individuals. So while the threat was concerning, it wasn't entirely unexpected. More threatening messages followed. In January of 2009, a physical letter arrived in the Coleman's mailbox. This one was more explicit, more personal. It threatened Shuri and the boys directly. The handwriting looked rushed, angry. The word opportunities was misspelled as opportunities. The police were notified. Officers began documenting the threats, though there wasn't much they could do without knowing who was sending them. Security around the Coleman home was increased. Patrol cars drove by more frequently. Chris discussed the situation with Joyce Meyer and her ministry staff. Everyone was taking the threats seriously, but there was an assumption that this was related to Chris's high-profile job, that some unhinged person had fixated on the family because of their connection to the famous televangelist. Sherry tried to continue with normal life, but the threats weighed on her. She confided in friends, expressing her fears, and then she said something that would later echo with terrible significance. She told a close friend, "If anything happens to me, Chris did it." Why would she say such a thing? What had Shiri noticed that others hadn't? The answer lay in Florida, in a city called Largo, where a woman named Tara Lintz lived and worked as a cocktail waitress. Tara Lintz had known Sherry Coleman for years. They had been best friends in high school at Largo High School in Florida. They even looked somewhat alike, both pretty with dark hair and slender builds. When Chris met Sherry, he met Tara too. Over the years, the three stayed in touch. Casual friends connected by Sherry's enduring bond with Tara. But sometime in late 2008, the nature of Chris and Tara's relationship changed dramatically. What exactly happened is something that would later be disputed in court. Tara would testify that their romantic relationship began in December of 2008. But photographs discovered later would tell a different story, showing Chris and Tara together, kissing in October of 2008. The date stamped on the back of one photo read November 5th, 2008, with a note that said, "The day Tara changed my life." Just 9 days after that date, the first threatening email was sent to Chris Coleman. This timing was not coincidental. Chris and Tara's relationship quickly became intense. They exchanged sexually explicit text messages and emails. They spoke on the phone constantly, when Chris traveled for work with Joyce Meyer Ministries. Attending conferences in places like Arizona and Hawaii, Tara would join him. They played out a fantasy of being a couple, free and together, wearing matching promise rings when they were alone. On Chris's laptop, investigators would later find a detailed note about Tara. It listed her birthday, her height, her eye color, her shoe size, her ring size, her jean size. It noted her favorite flowers and perfume. It contained preferences about food and sports teams. Next to the word Christmas, it read promise ring, loves, circle diamond or diamond cross. Most poignantly, there was an entry that read, "Our daughter's name, Zoe Lynn Coleman." Chris wasn't just having a casual affair. He was planning a future with Tara. A future that didn't include Sherry or Garrett, or Gavin, but there was a significant problem. Joyce Meyer Ministries was a conservative Christian organization that frowned upon divorce, especially for high-ranking employees. Chris earned over $100,000 a year in his position. If he divorced Sherry, if the affair came to light, he would almost certainly lose his job. And without that income, without that prestigious position, what would his life with Tara look like? Sherry had sensed something was wrong. By November of 2008, she suspected Chris was having an affair. She confronted him. Their arguments intensified, Friends later told investigators that Chris had told Sherry she was ruining his life. He wanted a divorce, but Sherry wasn't making it easy. Some friends said she was trying to work on the marriage, attending counseling, holding on to hope. But Chris had already made his decision, and he had begun laying the groundwork for a plan that was both methodical and monstrous. It was a Monday evening, warm with the promise of spring. In the Coleman household, it was supposed to be an ordinary night. 11-year-old Garrett had just celebrated his birthday on April 30th. He and his younger brother Gavin had wanted to have a sleepover with their friend Brandon from across the street. Garrett had asked their neighbor Vanessa Garrix, "Can we sleep over, please?" Vanessa had said yes, of course. The boys had sleepovers all the time. It was one of their rituals, especially around birthdays. Brandon's birthday was the next day, May 5th, when he would turn 9, the same age as Gavin. But for some reason that night, the sleepover didn't happen. The boys stayed home. The surveillance video from a neighbor's camera captured something seemingly innocent and utterly heartbreaking. It showed Chris Coleman in the front yard with Garrett, playing catch. A father and son tossing a ball back and forth on a beautiful evening. A perfect suburban scene, the kind of moment you'd want to remember forever. But within hours, that same father would commit an act so unspeakable that it defies comprehension. Sometime after 11 p.m. that night, when the house was dark and quiet, when Sherry and the boys were asleep in their beds, someone moved through the Coleman home with murderous intent. Forensic experts would later determine that Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin were killed sometime between 11 p.m. on May 4th and 3 a.m. on May 5th. The method was strangulation. Each victim had been strangled with some kind of cord or ligature, the assailant holding it tight around their necks for 4 to 5 minutes each. It was intimate violence, the kind that required physical proximity and sustained effort. Sherry had fought. She had 3 ligature marks on her neck, showing where the cord had shifted as she struggled. She had a black eye. She was a military-trained woman, strong and capable, and she had fought for her life. But ultimately she had lost. The boys were killed in their beds. They may never have fully woken up, may not have understood what was happening. It's a small mercy in an otherwise merciless act. And then after the murders, the killer had taken a can of apple red spray paint and painted messages on the walls. In Garrett's room, obscene words were spray painted on the sheet covering his body. In other parts of the house, the walls bore threatening messages. "I am always watch you. Have paid. Punished." It was staged to look like the work of whoever had been sending the threatening emails. The mysterious person who hated Chris Coleman because of his work for Joyce Meyer. But of course, there was no mysterious person. There never had been. Chris Coleman left his house at approximately 5:30 a.m. on May 5th, 2009. He drove to a gym in South St. Louis about 7.5 miles from his home. Security footage from the gym showed him arriving and working out. At 6:43 a.m., while still at the gym, Chris called his neighbor, Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow, of the Columbia Police Department. Chris and Barlow had known each other for 5 years, living across the street from one another. Barlow had been the officer who documented the threatening letters the Coleman family had received. Chris told Barlow that he'd been trying to reach Sherry all morning, but she wasn't answering her phone. The house phone, her cell phone, nothing. This was unusual. Could Barlow check on them? Barlow said he would. He walked across the street to the Coleman residence. He knocked on the door, rang the doorbell repeatedly. No answer. He peered through the narrow windows that framed the front door, but could see only darkness inside. Another officer arrived to assist. They walked around the house and discovered something concerning. A basement window at the back of the home was open, with the screen removed and propped against a patio table. Barlow and the other officer entered through the window. Immediately they noticed a strong chemical smell. Paint. As they made their way through the basement and up to the main floor, they saw the spray-painted messages on the walls, and then they went upstairs. What they found there would stay with them forever. Sherry was lying face down on her bed, naked, her head hanging over the side. Her body was stiff with rigor mortis. Blood had pooled in her chest, where it had settled after her heart stopped. The ligature marks on her throat told the story of her struggle. In the next room, 11-year-old Garrett lay deceased in his bed. The sheet covering his body had obscene words spray-painted on it. The paint transferred to his hand and arm. His face showed signs of asphyxiation. In another bedroom, 9-year-old Gavin lay motionless in his bed. More vulgar words were spray-painted across his bedroom walls. Long strands of dark hair, later determined to be Sherry's, were found in the crook of Gavin's elbow. As the officers processed this nightmare, they heard the garage door open. Chris Coleman was arriving home. It was just before 7 a.m. Another officer who had arrived met Chris outside and kept him there, away from the house. When Barlow and his colleague came out to inform Chris that his family was dead, Chris's reaction struck them as odd. He showed distress. Certainly. He was emotional. But he never asked how they died. He never asked what happened. He never tried to run upstairs to see them, something the officers had fully expected they would need to physically restrain him from doing. Instead, Chris sat on the driveway with his head in his hands. The Columbia Police Department immediately called in the Major Case Squad of Greater St. Louis, a special unit that assists smaller departments with complex cases. 25 seasoned detectives descended on the quiet subdivision. Chief Joe Edwards knew this was going to be the biggest case of their careers. Chris Coleman was taken to the police station for questioning. In his initial interview, he denied having an affair. He said his marriage was good, that he and Sherry had talked about divorce once, but had gone to counseling and things had been going awesome. When asked about Tara Lintz, he admitted knowing her, said she was Sherry's friend from high school. He acknowledged some sexy phone flirtation, but insisted it was nothing serious. He certainly didn't mention the promise rings. The detailed notes about their future together are the plan to marry in January of 2010. But investigators were already speaking to Tara in Florida, and she was telling a very different story. Tara told detectives that she and Chris had been in a full relationship. They'd had sexual encounters when he traveled for work. They'd made plans for a future together. Chris had told her he was going to serve Sherry with divorce papers on May 4th or May 5th. After the murders, Chris had emailed Tara to assure her that he wasn't the killer and that he had an alibi. When confronted with this information, Chris finally admitted to the affair, though he tried to minimize it. Meanwhile, the forensic evidence was piling up. Computer specialists examined Chris's work laptop. They discovered that the threatening email account, destroychris@google.com, had been created on his password-protected work computer, using his login credentials. The threatening emails had been sent from his computer. The IP address traced back to Joyce Meyer Ministries, but specifically to times when Chris had access to the laptop. Handwriting analysts examined the spray-painted messages on the walls and compared them to samples of Chris's handwriting. They found multiple similarities. The spray painting appeared to be someone trying to disguise their handwriting, but forensic linguists identified patterns. The threatening messages frequently started with the word fuck, which linguistic analysis showed was extremely rare in threatening communications. Only 18 out of 4,400 threats in the FBI's database began that way, and Chris's known writings showed the same pattern. The word opportunities had been misspelled as opportunities in one of the threatening letters. Chris had made the exact same misspelling in his personal emails. Investigators found a receipt from a hardware store dated February 9th, 2009, 3 months before the murders. The purchase was for a can of Rust-Oleum Apple Red spray paint. The computerized signature on the receipt read, Christopher E. Coleman. Forensic analysis of the spray paint on the walls confirmed it was Rust-Oleum Apple Red, a very specific product. Yet, when police searched Chris's home, his car, and anywhere else associated with him, they found no cans of spray paint. The medical examiner's testimony was perhaps the most damning. Dr. Michael Baden, a renowned forensic pathologist who had worked on many high-profile cases, reviewed the autopsy reports and crime scene evidence. He determined that Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin had been killed between approximately 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. on May 5th, well before Chris claimed to have left for the gym at 5:30 a.m. The bodies showed advanced rigor mortis when discovered. The blood had pooled in predictable patterns. There was no possibility. Dr. Baden testified that the murders had occurred after Chris left the house. This isn't even a close call, he said. They had to have been dead before he left the house. Cell phone tracking added another piece to the puzzle. Chris's phone showed that on the morning of May 5th, he had taken a longer route to the gym than usual, deviating from his normal path. What had he been doing? Disposing of evidence? The spray paint can was never found. On May 19th, 2009, 2 weeks after the murders, Christopher Coleman was arrested at his parents' home in Chester, Illinois. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The trial began on April 25th, 2011, almost exactly 2 years after the murders. Due to extensive pretrial publicity, the jury was bussed in from Perry County, an hour and a half away, to ensure an impartial panel. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney Chris Wright, laid out a methodical case. The motive was clear. Chris wanted to be with Tara, but divorce would have cost him his job and his comfortable lifestyle. Killing his family allowed him to start fresh, to play the grieving widower, to collect life insurance, and to eventually be with Tara without the professional consequences of divorce. The threatening emails and letters were a setup, a way to create a false narrative of an external threat. The spray-painted messages were meant to point to this phantom enemy. Joyce Meyer herself provided recorded testimony. She said she hadn't known about Chris's affair, but confirmed that it could have definitely affected his job. The ministry took moral conduct seriously, particularly for leadership positions. Tara Lintz was called to testify. It was a moment of high drama. 90 people had signed up to try to get into the courtroom to see her. She walked in wearing a black pantsuit with a pink blouse, black patent leather heels with pink trim, and a cross necklace, and on her finger she still wore the promise ring Chris had given her. She testified about their relationship, about the plans they'd made. She said Chris had told her he would be serving Shuri with divorce papers on May 4th or May 5th. She confirmed that they'd discussed a wedding date of January 2010, picking a time when Joyce Meyer wouldn't be too busy. The defense argued that someone had hacked Chris's computer to send the threatening messages and had broken into the house to commit the murders. They pointed out that no murder weapon was found, no spray paint was recovered from Chris's possession, and no paint residue was found on his body. Chris did not testify in his own defense. The jury deliberated for 15 hours over 2 days. It was tense. 4 jurors initially weren't convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. They worried about making such a momentous decision without absolute certainty. And then, almost by accident, one of the jurors picked up a photograph that had been sitting in the jury room since deliberations began. It was a photo of Chris and Tara together, kissing. The juror flipped it over. On the back was a date, October 21st, 2008. This was 2 months before Tara had testified their affair began. It proved that Chris had lied about when the relationship started. And if he'd lied about that, what else had he lied about? When we found that bit of evidence, everybody was like, okay, we're done. Juror Kim Ferrari later said, I thought we were going to be a hung jury, but then the more that we kept going, the more it made me see we just had to keep after it, and that we would find the information we needed. On May 5th, 2011, exactly 2 years after the murders, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. Guilty. 3 counts of first-degree murder. Chris Coleman showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. Christopher Coleman was initially eligible for the death penalty. The jurors later said they would have recommended it. The brutality of the crimes, the fact that he'd killed his own children in their beds, seemed to warrant the ultimate punishment. But Chris waived his right to be sentenced by the jury, and instead put his fate in the hands of Judge Milton Wharton. On May 9th, 2011, the judge sentenced Chris Coleman to 3 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would never be free again. The Coleman family held funerals for Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin at Evergreen Cemetery in Chester, Illinois. On May 9th, 2009, the small town came together in mourning. The loss of 2 innocent boys and their mother was incomprehensible. Sherry's family held a separate visitation in a Chicago suburb. Chris did not attend. There were bitter disputes about the burial arrangements. Chris, still legally Sherry's husband, had initial control over the decision of where the family would be buried. He wanted them in Chester, near his parents. Sherry's family objected strenuously. Eventually, a judge ruled that a convicted murderer should not have control over his victims' final resting places. The gravestone marking Sherry and her boys remained at Evergreen Cemetery, paid for by Chris's parents, Ron and Connie Coleman. Chris's own future gravesite had been planned right next to theirs, a detail that struck many as grotesque. Chris attempted multiple appeals. In 2014, his conviction was upheld. In an April 2018 interview with Crime Watch Daily, Chris maintained his innocence. He claimed he'd been set up, that he had two laptops, and the one connected to the threats was one he sometimes left at home. Or the office. His father, Ron Coleman, also continued to insist on his son's innocence, making statements that many found offensive. When asked about the affair being a possible motive, Ron said Tara was just meeting a need at the time that Sherry wasn't taken care of. He added, "Well, I mean, every man has his desires, and every man has to be respected." These comments did not help Chris's cause. Today, Christopher Coleman is incarcerated at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waup in Wisconsin. He is 57 years old. He will die in prison. What makes someone capable of such an act? How does a man look at his wife of 12 years, the mother of his children, and decide she's expendable? How does a father enter his son's bedrooms? Boys he raised and played catch with, and tucked into bed, and end their lives. The answer lies somewhere in the dark space between selfishness and evil, between desire and depravity. Chris Coleman wanted a new life. He wanted Tara. He wanted to avoid the professional and financial consequences of divorce. And so he made a choice that most people could never fathom. He decided the obstacles to his desired future needed to be eliminated. He planned it methodically. He sent himself threatening messages for months, building a narrative. He purchased the spray paint weeks in advance. He chose a time when no one would see him, when his family was most vulnerable, and then he carried it out. He strangled Sherry despite her struggle. He strangled Garrett. He strangled Gavin. He spray painted the walls to complete his staging. He disposed of evidence. And then he went to the gym, establishing an alibi. When the police told him his family was dead, he played the role of shocked husband and father, but it was all performance. Inside, he'd already moved on. He was texting Tara even as the investigation unfolded. He was thinking about their future together. The human capacity for compartmentalization is staggering. Chris Coleman could watch his sons play, could sit at the dinner table with his wife, all while planning their deaths. It speaks to a profound disconnection from empathy, from the normal bonds that tie families together. The case reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always look monstrous. Sometimes it looks like the nice neighbor, the church-going family man, the respected employee. Chris Coleman was all these things, and he was also a murderer. It's important, in a story like this, not to let the horror of the crime overshadow the lives that were lost. Sherry Coleman was 31 years old when she died. She had served her country in the Air Force. She was described by everyone who knew her as sweet, kind, and deeply faithful. She loved her sons more than anything. She had tried to make her marriage work, even when she suspected Chris was having an affair. She had told a friend, "If anything happens to me, Chris did it," but perhaps she never truly believed it would come to that. Perhaps she couldn't imagine that the man she'd married, the father of her children, could be capable of such evil. Garrett Coleman was 11 years old, just days past his birthday when he was killed. He loved football. He loved Legos. He was energetic and popular at school. He had his whole life ahead of him. Years of birthdays and holidays and friendships and eventually, perhaps, a family of his own. All of it stolen. Gavin Coleman was 9 years old. He loved baseball. He was thoughtful and kind. The night before he died, he'd wanted to have a sleepover with his friend Brandon. For some reason it didn't happen, and the next morning Gavin was gone. His friend Brandon made a Lego memorial, a Lego lady and 2 little boys, with a note that said, "Now you're in heaven with your mommy." These 3 lives mattered. They were more than just victims in a true crime story. They were real people with hopes and dreams, and people who loved them. The community of Columbia, Illinois was shaken by their loss. Neighbors who had waved to the Colemans, who had watched Garrett and Gavin play in the yard, now looked at the house on Robert Drive with sadness and disbelief. Vanessa Rieger-X, the neighbor who had become close to Shuri and the boys, set up a memorial in the Colemans' front yard after their deaths. Mother's Day balloons, signed footballs, the Lego memorial from Brandon. It was a gesture of love and grief. And then, according to Vanessa, she watched from her yard as Chris Coleman picked up the entire memorial and threw it in the trash. Even that small kindness was too much for him to bear. And so, our story ends as it began, in a house by a lake in Columbia, Illinois. The house still stands, though the family who lived there is gone forever. The case of the Coleman family murders is a reminder that darkness can exist anywhere, even in the most peaceful suburbs, even in seemingly perfect families. It's a reminder that threats can come from the least expected places. And it's a reminder that justice, though it may move slowly, does eventually arrive. Christopher Coleman sits in a prison cell tonight, as he will every night for the rest of his life. Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin rest together. Their struggles over, their pain ended. And in Columbia, Illinois, the lake still reflects the moonlight, the streets are still quiet, and families still live their lives, holding their loved ones a little closer, grateful for each ordinary day. Let this story carry you now into rest. Let the weight of tragedy remind you of the preciousness of peace. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply. Tomorrow you will wake to a new day. A gift that Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin never received. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we'll explore a case that unfolded in the quiet town of Simpsonville, South Carolina. A story about broken promises, hidden darkness, and the pursuit of justice that spanned nearly a decade. This is the case of Catherine Blauvelt, known to everyone who loved her as Cathy. Catherine Ann Boyder was born on August 8, 1994, in the small town of Mountville, South Carolina. Her mother, Patricia, called her Cathy from the very beginning, and the name stuck. It suited her perfectly. She was the kind of person who brought light into every room she entered. Cathy grew up in a blended family, full of warmth and noise and life. She had 2 biological siblings, Brandon and Brittany, but when her mother remarried Daniel Piver, Cathy welcomed 4 more sisters and another brother with open arms. Family meant everything to her. Her stepfather became someone she truly loved, someone she could count on. Those who knew Cathy described her as a free spirit. She stood just 5 feet 1 inch tall, a tiny woman with an enormous heart. Her mother would say that Cathy was the kind of person who would befriend a cricket. Animals drew to her naturally, and she to them. She dreamed of working with animals one day, of building a life where she could care for creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. After finishing high school, Cathy enrolled at Greenfield Community College in 2015. She was still figuring out her path, taking classes, working temporary jobs. For a while she worked at Firehouse Subs, a sandwich shop in Greenville County. The work was simple, but it paid the bills while she figured out what came next. It was at that sandwich shop where her life would change forever. In 2014, Staff Sergeant John Tufton Blauvelt was 26 years old and living his dream. He worked as a recruiter for the United States Army at the Armed Forces Center in Greenville County. To the community of Simpsonville, a quiet town of around 20,000 people, John was the public face of the military. He cut an impressive figure in his crisp uniform, decorated with service ribbons. He told stories about his deployments to Iraq, stories that made young people lean in and listen. At local high schools, John set up recruiting booths, talking to teenagers about duty, honor, and service. Many saw him as a role model, a person of principle, someone willing to sacrifice for his country. John's recruiting office sat just yards away from the Firehouse Subs where Katie worked. It was inevitable, really, that they would meet. When they did, something sparked between them. John was 26. Katie had just turned 20. Friends say they seemed happy at first. They dated for several months, and in the summer of 2015, John convinced Katie to enlist in the Army herself. She went through with it, excited about the possibility of serving alongside her boyfriend. But 2 months into her training, doctors discovered a problem with her spine. The medical issue ended her military career before it truly began. Cady received a medical discharge, and with it her dreams of military service dissolved. While Kachi's hopes were dashed, John's career continued to thrive, or so it seemed. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Cady surprised her family with news they hadn't expected. She and John had gotten married at the courthouse. No ceremony, no celebration, just the two of them and a justice of the peace. Her mother, Patty, was shocked. So was her sister, Jennifer. Neither had expected this. They'd barely gotten to know John. He'd never seemed interested in getting to know Cady's family. Never engaged in meaningful conversations with them. But Cady was in love, and she was an adult. She made her choice. She moved into John's house in Simpsonville, ready to start their life together. At first, marriage seemed to suit them, but the honeymoon period didn't last long. Almost immediately after they returned from their brief honeymoon, something shifted in John's behavior. The house that was supposed to be their home, the place where Cady imagined raising children and building a future, transformed into something else entirely. John began inviting people over. Not friends his own age, but teenagers. Kids from Hillcrest High School, where he often worked his recruiting booth. They came to smoke weed, to drink, to use drugs. The house became a party destination. One of those teenagers was a girl named Allie Somerville, a friend of Cady's. She was 16 years old. She would later describe the scene. They smoked weed all day, every day. Sometimes there was alcohol. Sometimes there was acid and cocaine. And at the center of it all was John Blovelt, the U.S. Army recruiter, letting underage kids party in his home. Another frequent visitor was a 17-year-old girl named Hannah Thompson. Cady watched her dream crumble. This wasn't what she wanted. She'd envisioned a family, stability, a home filled with love and perhaps children someday. Instead, she found herself living in what amounted to a crash pad for teenagers. She confronted John. She told him it had to stop, but John didn't stop. And Hannah Thompson kept coming around. Friends noticed something troubling. Hannah was completely infatuated with John. One investigator would later describe Hannah as being like John's puppy, willing to do anything he wanted. And Hannah, they said, hated Cady. By early 2016, Cady had moved out. She went back to live with her mother. The marriage that had begun with such promise had fallen apart in a matter of months. Cady told her mother she planned to file for divorce, but the situation was about to get much worse. On the night of February 26, 2016, police received a call from Hannah Thompson's father. He was concerned about his daughter, who had been spending time at John Blovelt's house. Officers went to John's home to investigate. That visit resulted in John being arrested and charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor. His clean-cut image as an Army recruiter was tarnished. A mugshot replaced his professional military portrait. But that same day, Cady went to the police with information even more troubling. She told them that a month earlier, in January, John had pulled a gun on her. He'd pointed it at her head and threatened to kill her. Not just her, but her entire family. The Fountain Inn Police Department investigated and charged John with domestic violence. A restraining order was issued. John and Cady were legally prohibited from seeing each other. The consequences came swiftly. The Department of the Army cut John's pay and suspended him from recruiting duties. The job that defined him, the role he built his entire identity around, was stripped away. He was reassigned to a small back office while the Army conducted an investigation that could lead to his dismissal. Friends say John was furious. He blamed Cady for everything. In his mind, she had ruined his life. He told people she'd taken everything from him, and he began talking about revenge. Despite the restraining order, John and Cady still had occasional contact. There were still belongings at the house they'd shared, practical matters to sort out. Neither could fully walk away yet, and John, it seems, was planning something. Autumn came to South Carolina. The leaves changed colors and there was a crispness in the air. Katie had moved forward with her life as best she could. She worked at a pet store in Greenville, finally pursuing her love of animals. She had plans to go back to school. She spent time with friends and family. On Sunday, October 23rd, 2016, Cady worked her shift at the pet store. She clocked out at 2:15 in the afternoon. Before leaving work, she took a selfie from inside her car. It was 4:17 in the evening when she used her phone for the last time. Katy was supposed to meet friends that evening. When she didn't show up, they grew concerned. They tried calling. No answer. They waited, thinking maybe she'd gotten delayed. But as hours passed and night fell, worry turned to alarm. By the next morning, Katy's family knew something was terribly wrong. This wasn't like her. She always stayed in touch. She always showed up when she said she would. Her mother filed a missing persons report, and the community mobilized. Friends searched. Family members called everyone they could think of. On October 26, 2016, a friend of both Katy and John decided to check an abandoned farmhouse in Simpsonville. It was a place they'd hung out when they were younger, an old, forgotten building surrounded by woods. The friend's name was Wayne Roper. He walked through the empty house, checking rooms. Everything looked abandoned, but when he descended into the basement, he found something that would haunt him forever. Katy was there. Her body had been placed in a concrete box. She'd been stabbed multiple times. The blade of the knife had broken off and was still lodged in her neck. Wayne called the police immediately. Less than 1 minute after finding her, officers were on their way. Catherine Blauvelt, just 22 years old, was dead. Detectives Keith Moorcraft and Cheryl Schofield took charge of the investigation. Their first task was the death notification, informing Katy's family of what had been found. Then they had to notify her estranged husband. They went to see John Blauvelt on October 26. When they told him his wife was dead, his reaction struck them as odd. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't ask the normal questions. Where did you find her? How did she die? What happened? He simply listened. And then he said something that revealed his state of mind. She flipped my life upside down. A week later, on November 2nd, investigators brought John in for a formal interview. They advised him of his rights. They asked about his relationship with Katy, and John told them he'd lost a friend. Maybe not the best wife, he said, but a friend nonetheless. He mentioned that he'd been to the funeral home to see Katy's body. He'd taken Hannah Thompson with him. He claimed he hadn't seen Katy in months, but investigators were already building a case. They looked at phone records. They examined the crime scene, and what they found painted a very different picture. John Blauvelt's phone told a story. On October 24th at 5:03 in the evening, John called Hannah Thompson. 1 minute later at 5:04, he sent her an instant message telling her to check her Snapchat. The contents of that Snapchat message had been deleted from John's phone, but investigators had ways of recovering such things. The message Hannah received showed Katy's body. Text messages between John and Hannah revealed more. She's gone, John wrote. Another message said, I'm going through with that thing. John's search history was even more damning. In the days leading up to Katy's murder, he'd searched for how to sharpen a knife. After her death, he searched for what to do when your wife dies. And when can police tap your phone? He repeatedly searched his own name combined with Simpsonville and Greenville, checking to see if he'd been mentioned in the news. But perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence was something John had written himself. In John's personal journal, investigators found entries that amounted to a confession. He'd written a message to his daughter Madison, who he had with Katy. The words were haunting. Someday I hope you understand why I did it, he wrote. The girl was evil to me. She treated me like dirt. She took everything from me, including you. I am sorry that I had to do it. To do that, but there was no other way for me. There was no other way for me. Sorry, bud. I love you. The journal also contained other telling entries. Simply stated, I did it. Investigators spoke with people who knew John. Several witnesses came forward to say that John had talked about wanting to kill Katy. One person even claimed that John had approached them offering to split a $100,000 insurance payout if they would help him commit the murder. The case against John Blauvelt was building, but there was a problem. John was nowhere to be found. On November 18th, 2016, the Simpsonville police obtained arrest warrants for John Blauvelt. He was charged with murder and possession of a weapon during a violent crime. But when officers went to arrest him, he'd vanished. Hannah Thompson had vanished too. On November 21st, Hannah's parents reported their 17-year-old daughter missing. Investigators quickly realized what had happened. John had fled, and he'd taken Hannah with him. The U.S. Marshals Service joined the manhunt. They classified John Blauvelt as armed and dangerous. Investigator Cheryl Schofield later said she was deeply concerned for Hannah's safety. If John was willing to kill his own wife, she reasoned, there was no telling what danger Hannah might be in. Security footage and tips began to paint a picture of their route. John and Hannah traveled through Alabama. They went through Texas. They made their way to New Mexico, where John was spotted in Las Cruces on November 15th. They continued west to California, and eventually to Oregon. They were living homeless, moving from place to place. After about a month on the run, Hannah had had enough. She contacted a family friend in Eugene, Oregon on December 12th. She said she wanted to come home. John had abandoned her by that point, leaving her stranded. Hannah returned to South Carolina. She talked to investigators, but at first she didn't tell them everything she knew. She provided some information about where John might be, but she left out crucial details. Meanwhile, John Blauvelt disappeared into Oregon. Determined to stay hidden, the Army classified John as a deserter. His military career, once his greatest pride, was officially over. John Blauvelt didn't return to South Carolina. He didn't turn himself in. Instead, he created a new identity. He began calling himself Ben Klein. He settled in Medford, Oregon, a city of about 85,000 people in the southern part of the state. There, living under his fake name, he tried to build a new life. He even began a relationship with a woman who believed his name was Ben. They lived together. She had no idea who he really was. Years passed. 2017 became 2018, then 2019. The case was featured on the television show In Pursuit with John Walsh. But still, John remained free. For Katie's family, the wait was excruciating. Her mother, Patty, thought about Katie's death every single day. The image of what had been done to her daughter never left. Friends and family members began to lose hope. Some thought John was the kind of person who would get away with it, that justice would never come. Back in South Carolina, the case remained open. It haunted investigator Keith Morecraft. It was the only unsolved case he still carried, but investigators never stopped looking. And neither did the U.S. Marshals. In early 2022, a dedicated cold case team at the U.S. Marshals headquarters took another look at the Blauvelt case. They worked with investigators from South Carolina, with the Simpsonville Police, with the South Carolina Highway Patrol, and with the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. They followed every lead, tracked down every tip, and then something changed with Hannah Thompson. In June of 2022, 6 years after Katie's murder, Hannah Thompson sat down for another interview with police. And this time she revealed something she'd been hiding. She and John had been in contact the entire time. From the moment she returned to South Carolina in December 2016, she'd been talking to John. At first they talked every single day, multiple times a day, for hours at a time. Nobody knew. Not her family. Not the police. Nobody. Hannah admitted that John had told her what he'd done to Katie. He described it in detail. He told her he'd stabbed Katie in the neck. He told her he'd had to drag her body back to the abandoned house, where he killed her. He said he'd thrown her phone into water that was on the ground in the basement. He said he'd covered up her blood with dirt. Hannah had driven John to Katie's workplace on October 24th. She'd dropped him off near the pet store where Katie worked. This information was crucial. It placed John at the scene. With Hannah's new testimony and information about John's location in Oregon, investigators finally had what they needed. The U.S. Marshals Pacific Northwest Violent Offender Task Force committed significant resources to finding John. They worked with Medford Police and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. On July 20th, 2022, they found him. Officers took John Blauvelt to the ground. He was in pure shock. They said, when they asked if he was John Blauvelt, he insisted his name was Ben. He claimed they had the wrong person, but they didn't. After 6 years on the run, after 2,086 days as a fugitive, John Tufton Blauvelt was finally in custody. John was extradited back to South Carolina. Hannah Thompson was also arrested and charged with 5 felonies: obstruction of justice, accessory after the fact, misprision of a felony, and concealing a felony. She faced up to 55 years in prison. John's trial began in September 2024, 8 years after Katie's death. Prosecutors Kinley Abbey and John Meters presented the state's case. They started with the evidence that couldn't be ignored: The knife blade still lodged in Caddy's neck. The text messages, the phone searches, the journal entries. But their key witness was Hannah Thompson. Hannah took the stand. She admitted she'd loved John Blauvelt. The defense immediately questioned her credibility. She'd lied in previous interviews, they pointed out. She'd given 7 different versions of events before finally telling the full truth at trial. She had 5 pending felony charges hanging over her head. But the prosecution made a crucial point. Hannah had no deal with the state. No charges had been dismissed. No promises had been made. She faced 55 years in prison, and she was testifying anyway, telling the truth at last. Hannah described what John had told her. The stabbing, the dragging of Caddy's body, the disposal of evidence. She described how he'd sent her that Snapchat message showing Caddy's body. She told the jury about driving John to Caddy's workplace that day. The defense argued tunnel vision. They pointed out the DNA evidence at the scene was only a partial match to John. They noted that other fingerprints at the scene had never been examined. They claimed the journal was filled with fictional stories and fantasies, not confession. But the prosecution's case was strong. They called witnesses who testified that John had talked about killing Caddy. They presented the phone records, the search history, the timeline of events. They walked the jury through John's behavior after Caddy's death. His flight, his years in hiding. Caddy's mother took the stand. Patricia Peaver described her daughter as sunshine. She told the jury about the frantic search when Caddy disappeared. She spoke about the years of waiting, wondering if her daughter's killer would ever face justice. After 4 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for about 5 hours. On September 20th, 2024, the verdict came in. Guilty of murder. Guilty of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. The courtroom was quiet, emotional. Caddy's family cried. After 8 years, they finally had justice. The judge sentenced John Blauvelt immediately. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. John Blauvelt filed an appeal in February 2025, but he remains in prison. His military career is over. His freedom is gone. The man who once stood in schools wearing his uniform with pride now wears prison clothing instead. Hannah Thompson's case took a different turn. In August 2025, she pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and concealing a felony. Instead of 55 years in prison, she received 3 years of probation. No jail time. Tati's family was devastated by Hannah's sentence. Patricia Peaver said it felt like a slap on the wrist for what Hannah had done. A punch in the gut to the family. They'd asked for a harsher sentence. They felt that Hannah's years of lying, her months of being in contact with John while he was on the run, warranted more than probation. Jennifer Peaver, Caddy's sister, said she thought Hannah was just a stupid 17-year-old until she learned at trial how long Hannah had been in contact with John. The betrayal felt deep. Hannah had known the truth for 6 years and had continued talking to the man who murdered Caddy. But for Caddy's family, there's also relief. John Blauvelt will never walk free again. He'll never hurt anyone else. And Caddy's name, her memory, will live on. Those who loved Cati, remember her as she was. 5 feet 1 inch of pure sunshine. A free spirit who loved animals and would befriend anyone. Even a cricket. A young woman who wanted nothing more than a stable life. A family. A home filled with love. She was 22 years old when she died. She never got to be a mother. She never got to fulfill her dreams of working with animals. She never got to see how her life might have unfolded. But she's not forgotten. Her family makes sure of that. They hold vigils on the anniversary of her death. They speak her name. They remember her laugh, her kindness, her light. In the quiet town of Simpsonville, South Carolina, Cati Blauvelt's story stands as a reminder of the danger that can hide behind a uniform, a reminder that domestic violence can escalate to murder, a reminder that justice, though slow, can still arrive, and a reminder that even in death, Cati's light continues to shine. And that's where we'll leave the story tonight. Catherine Blauvelt, known as Katie to those who loved her, is gone but not forgotten. Her family continues to fight for her memory. They continue to speak her name. As you drift off to sleep, remember that true crime stories are more than mysteries to solve. They're about real people, real lives, real families left behind to grieve, and may Kay rest in peace. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we journey into a story that unfolded in the heart of Brooklyn, where trust was betrayed in the most unthinkable way. This is the story of Omar Murray, a hard-working man whose life was stolen by those closest to him. Omar Murray was 37 years old when his story ended. But to understand how it ended, we must first understand who he was. Born in Jamaica, Omar had come to New York with dreams like so many before him. He found his calling as an iron worker, one of those invisible builders who shaped the skyline of a city. It was dangerous work, demanding work. But Omar approached it with the same steady determination he brought to everything in his life. He was a man of faith. Every Sunday you could find him at the Full Gospel Assembly of God Church in Crown Heights, a place where he found community and spiritual grounding. His family back in Jamaica knew him as reliable, devoted, someone who sent money home and never forgot where he came from. His mother, Eunice Ashley Henry, raised him to be good, to be kind, to trust in the Lord. And Omar lived by those principles. In 2009, Omar met Alicia Noel. She was younger than him, only 21 to his 33. She worked as a home health aide with the Visiting Nurse Service of New York. She came from a Caribbean background like Omar, the daughter of a Guyanese-born registered nurse named Pauline and a Grenadian-born construction worker named Andrew. Her parents had separated, but both remained in Brooklyn. Alicia was attractive, charismatic, and seemed interested in building a life with Omar. They married quickly, swept up in what appeared to be a whirlwind romance. To those on the outside, they seemed like a good match. Two young people from immigrant families trying to make their way in New York. After their marriage, they moved into a row house in Brownsville, Brooklyn. The house belonged to Alicia's mother, Pauline, who had worked hard as a nurse to acquire property. The address was 204 Lott Avenue, a modest home in a neighborhood that had seen better days but still held pockets of community and hope. Omar was a provider. He worked long hours, dangerous hours, climbing steel structures high above the city. The money was good, and he wanted to give Alicia everything she desired. He was building what he thought was a partnership, a future. In 2009, shortly after their marriage, they took out a life insurance policy with National Benefit Life Insurance for $530,000. It seemed like a responsible decision, the kind of thing married couples do to protect each other. Later, they took out additional insurance, another policy for $150,000, then more. In total, the policies on Omar's life eventually totaled nearly $900,000. At the time, it might have seemed like simple financial planning, protection in case something happened on those steel beams high above the city. Omar trusted his wife. He signed the papers, but trust, as we'll see, can be a fragile thing. By 2012, the marriage had changed. Omar and Alicia had a child together, a baby girl who was not yet a year old. But beneath the surface of domestic life, something dark was growing. Omar, for all his devotion, was not perfect. He had made a mistake. He had been unfaithful. He had been with a prostitute. When Alicia discovered this betrayal, something inside her shifted. Perhaps it was anger. Perhaps it was hurt. But what came next went far beyond the normal reactions to infidelity. In October of 2012, Alicia made her first attempt to kill her husband. She poisoned his dinner. We don't know exactly what substance she used or how much, but Omar became ill. He survived. Perhaps he didn't realize what had happened. Perhaps he attributed his sickness to food poisoning, to bad luck, to anything but the truth, which was that the woman he trusted had tried to end his life. She had worked as a home health aide, someone trained to care for the sick and vulnerable. She would have known about medications, about dosages, about what could harm the human body. But the attempt failed. Omar recovered. Most people faced with a failed murder attempt might abandon the idea entirely. The risk of getting caught, the moral weight of taking a life, the simple logistics. All of these would deter a normal person. But Alicia was not deterred. If anything, the failed poisoning seemed to crystallize something in her mind. She wanted Omar dead, and she wanted the insurance money. Around this same time, Alicia began an affair. His name was Demian Lovell, and he was 29 years old, just 4 years older than Alicia. We don't know exactly how they met or how the affair began, but it became serious quickly. And at some point in their relationship, Alicia confided in him. She told him about the life insurance policies. She told him she needed Omar dead. And Damian, instead of recoiling from this confession, instead of going to the police or trying to talk her out of it, agreed to help. Together, they began to plot murder. The plan was to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Omar would be shot. The house would appear to have been broken into, and no one would suspect the grieving widow who had just lost her husband to random violence. It was a plan built on cold calculation and greed. Damian knew people. He reached out to someone he thought could do the job. Someone willing to kill a stranger for money. We don't know the name of this first hired killer, only that he agreed to the job. On February 6, 2013, exactly 18 days before Omar would actually die, the first assassin made his attempt. He approached Omar. He had a gun. He fired, and he missed. Omar survived. Whether he realized someone had tried to kill him, whether he reported it to the police, whether he confronted Alicia about any suspicions he might have had, we don't know. The historical record is silent on Omar's thoughts during those final weeks of his life. We can only imagine what it must have been like, going about his daily routine, working on those iron beams, coming home to his wife and baby daughter, perhaps feeling that something was wrong but unable to put his finger on what. For Alicia and Damian, the failed attempt was a problem. The shooter had proven unreliable. They needed someone else, someone who wouldn't miss. Damian found Kirk Porteous. Kirk was 25 years old and had a history of violent crime. He was the kind of person who would kill for money, who wouldn't ask too many questions about why or whether the target deserved to die. The deal was simple. Kirk would be paid $3,500 total to kill Omar Murray. Damian provided him with $500 as a down payment, and Alicia provided the gun. The very weapon that would be used to kill her husband came from her hands. She gave it to Damian, who gave it to Kirk. Everything was in place. The only thing left was to wait for the right moment. Sunday, February 24th, 2013 began like many Sundays in the Murray household. It was early afternoon, around 1 o'clock. Omar had gone out, perhaps to the store, perhaps to run an errand. Alicia was home with their 10-month-old daughter. She knew what was about to happen. She had orchestrated it. When Omar returned home, Kirk Porteous was waiting. As Omar approached the entrance of his house at 204 Lot Avenue, Kirk confronted him. There was no conversation, no dramatic exchange. This wasn't personal for Kirk. It was just a job. Kirk shot Omar once in the chest. Then as Omar stumbled forward, trying to reach safety, trying to get inside his own home, Kirk shot him 2 more times. 3 bullets total. Omar collapsed in the entrance hallway of his house. His blood spread across the floor of the home, where he had lived with his wife and child. Upstairs, Alicia locked herself in the bedroom with the baby. She called 911. When the operator answered, Alicia played the role of the terrified wife. She said there had been a shooting. She said her husband had been attacked. She made it sound like a home invasion, a robbery, a random act of violence. The ambulance arrived quickly. Paramedics rushed Omar to Brookdale University Hospital, but the damage was too severe. 3 bullets at close range. Omar Murray died a few hours later. He was 37 years old. He left behind a mother in Jamaica, siblings who loved him, friends from his church community, and a 10-month-old daughter who would never really know her father. Kirk Porteous fled the scene with Dion Jack, a 22-year-old who had agreed to be the getaway driver. They disappeared into the Brooklyn streets. And Alicia, alone in her house with her baby and her husband's body cooling in the hallway, prepared to play the part of the grieving widow. The New York Police Department treats every murder seriously, but homicides in Brownsville were not uncommon. The neighborhood had struggled with violence for years. At first glance, Omar's death might have seemed like another tragic statistic, another case of someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. But detectives began to ask questions. They canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed witnesses. They looked at the scene carefully. And within 24 hours, they had arrested 3 men. Damien Lovell was picked up first. When detectives interrogated him, he broke quickly. He told them everything. He told them about his affair with Alicia. He told them about the life insurance policies. He told them about the plot to kill Omar. He told them about the first failed attempt on February 6th and the second successful attempt on February 24th. He gave them Kirk Porteous's name and described how he had hired him, paid him, and provided him with the gun that came from Alicia. Kirk Porteous was arrested next. He too confessed. He admitted to being the shooter. He described how he had waited for Omar, how he had shot him 3 times, how he had fled with Dion Jack driving. Dion Jack, the getaway driver, was also taken into custody. He was charged with hindering prosecution. His bail was set at $5,000. He was a smaller player in the scheme, but he had knowingly helped murderers escape. Kirk Porteous and Damien Lovell were held without bond at Rikers Island, New York City's notorious jail complex. But Alicia, she was not arrested. Not yet. On Friday night, March 8th, 2013, 12 days after Omar's murder, his funeral was held at the Full Gospel Assembly of God Church in Crown Heights. This was the church where Omar had worshipped faithfully, where he had prayed and found community. Now his body lay in a casket at the front of the sanctuary while friends and family gathered to mourn. Alicia attended the funeral. She sat in the front pew, the place reserved for the closest family. And as the service proceeded, as people wept and shared memories of Omar, Alicia sat chewing gum. Omar's uncle was there. He watched Alicia carefully. After the service, he spoke to a reporter from the New York Daily News. His words were blunt and angry. He said that seeing Alicia sitting there with her crocodile tears made him sick. He said they knew she had killed Omar. He asked where the justice was. Other reporters approached Alicia as well. She denied everything. She said she wasn't hiding from anyone. She called the accusations ridiculous. She played the part of the wronged widow, the innocent woman being blamed for something she didn't do. And for a time, she walked free. The police had arrested the 3 men directly involved in the murder, but building a case against Alicia would take more work. They needed to follow the money, establish her motive clearly, and build an airtight case. Meanwhile, Alicia did something that would later prove crucial to the prosecution's case. She tried to cash in the life insurance policies within days of Omar's death, before his body was even cold in the ground. Alicia contacted the insurance companies. She wanted her money. She was the beneficiary on policies totaling nearly $900,000, and she wanted to collect. But the insurance companies weren't fooled. When they learned that local prosecutors suspected Alicia of orchestrating her husband's murder, they refused to pay. National Benefit Life Insurance and the other insurers would not hand over a cent. Alicia even sued National Benefit, trying to force them to pay. She lost. The woman who had killed for money would never see a penny of it. For more than 3 years. Alicia Noel Murray lived as a free woman. She had not been charged with Omar's murder. Kirk Porteous and Damien Lovell sat in Rikers Island, waiting for their trials. But Alicia went about her life. During this time, she did something remarkable. She remarried. Less than a year after Omar's death, Alicia found another man and married him. We don't know much about this second husband, only that he existed and that Alicia was willing to move on remarkably quickly from the husband she had murdered. Did the second husband know what she had done? Did he know that the woman he married was under investigation for murder for hire? We don't know. But it shows a certain coldness, a certain ability to compartmentalize, that Alicia could sit at Omar's funeral, chewing gum, and then months later stand at another altar making wedding vows to someone new. Prosecutors were not idle during this time. They were building their case. They were interviewing witnesses, following the money trail, documenting the life insurance policies, and preparing to bring charges. In June of 2016, more than 3 years after Omar's death, they finally had what they needed. Alicia Noel Murray was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. In March of 2017, Damien Lovell made a decision. Rather than face a trial where he might be convicted of first-degree murder and spend the rest of his life in prison, He accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 15 years to life. And he agreed to testify against Alicia and Kirk. His testimony would be crucial. He was the link between Alicia and the murder. He could describe how she had asked him to find someone to kill Omar, how she had provided the gun, how she had talked about the insurance money and her need to cash in. Without Damien's testimony, the case against Alicia would be much weaker. In June of 2017, Alicia went to trial before Brooklyn Supreme Court Justice Neil Feiertug. The jury listened to days of testimony. They heard from Damien Lovell, who described the affair and the murder plot in detail. They heard about the life insurance policies. They heard about the poisoning attempt in October of 2012. They heard about the first failed shooting on February 6th and the successful murder on February 24th. The defense argued that Alicia was innocent, that she had nothing to do with the murder, that she loved Omar. Her lawyer, Winton Sharp, insisted she was being framed, but the evidence was overwhelming. It took the jury just 3 hours to reach a verdict. On June 8th, 2017, they found Alicia Noel Murray guilty of first-degree murder. 1 week later, Kirk Porteous went to trial before a separate jury. He was the trigger man, the one who had actually fired the fatal shots. His trial was shorter. The evidence against him was even more direct. He had confessed. He had been caught fleeing the scene. On June 14th, 2017, the jury found Kirk Porteous guilty of first-degree murder and second-degree criminal possession of a weapon. Both Alicia and Kirk faced mandatory sentences of life in prison without the possibility of parole. On June 29, 2017, more than 4 years after Omar Murray's murder, Alicia Noel Murray and Kirk Porteous appeared before Justice Neil Feiertug for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with Omar's family and friends. They had waited a long time for this moment. Before the judge imposed sentence, Omar's family was given the opportunity to speak. These victim impact statements are often the most emotional part of a criminal proceeding, the moment when the human cost of a crime becomes most visible. Omar's brother, Andrew Knight, spoke first. He said he had thought Alicia loved Omar. He said he had thought she was part of the family. The betrayal cut deep, not just because Omar had been killed, but because it had been done by someone who had shared his bed, his home, his life. Nicole Bardon, Omar's cousin, read a statement written by Omar's mother, Eunice Ashley Henry, who was in Jamaica and could not attend. The words were searing. She told Alicia that she should spend 900,000 years in prison, 1 year for every dollar she had thought she would get for her son's life. She said that the family was moving on, but that Alicia would always think of them. It was a curse and a promise. Throughout these statements, Alicia showed no emotion. Family members later said she rolled her eyes, pouted, and seemed bored. She refused to apologize. She refused to show remorse. Even facing life in prison, she maintained the facade of innocence. Kirk Porteous's lawyer argued that his client felt remorse, that he was a father who understood the pain of Omar's family. But Kirk, like Alicia, stood stone-faced. Whatever regret he might have felt was not visible. Assistant District Attorney Emily Dean spoke on behalf of the prosecution. She said that Alicia hadn't cared about Omar at all. To Alicia, Omar had been nothing more than a $900,000 check. Dean emphasized the premeditation, the coldness, the calculations. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a business transaction in Alicia's mind, and Omar's life was the price. Finally, Justice Neil Feiertug spoke. He imposed a mandatory sentence on both defendants. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Acting Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez released a statement saying that with their premeditated and callous actions, these two defendants had forfeited their right to remain part of society. They had planned and carried out the heinous and cruel execution of an innocent man for nothing more than pure greed. The courtroom erupted in applause. Omar's family finally had justice. The story might have ended there. Alicia and Kirk went to prison. Damien Lovell served his 15-year sentence. Tian Jacques, the getaway driver, received a lesser sentence for his minor role. Justice had been served. But in July of 2022, there was a twist. The New York State Appellate Division, Second Department, reviewed Alicia's conviction and found a problem. The trial judge, Justice Feiertug, had failed to instruct the jury that Damien Lovell was an accomplice. and that his testimony needed to be corroborated. In New York law, the testimony of an accomplice alone is not enough to convict someone. There needs to be independent evidence backing up the accomplice's claims. The appellate court found that while there was additional evidence against Kurt Porsche's, the case against Alicia had relied heavily on Damien's testimony. Without proper instructions to the jury about how to evaluate that testimony, Alicia had not received a fair trial. The conviction was overturned. Alicia Noel Murray was granted a new trial. As of the most recent information available, Alicia remains in prison while the case works its way back through the court system. She continues to maintain her innocence. Her lawyer David Crow from the Legal Aid Society argued that without proper scrutiny of Damien's testimony, without the jury being warned that an accomplice has every reason to lie to save his own skin, the state didn't really have a case. Whether Alicia will be retried, whether she will be convicted again, whether she will ultimately die in prison as originally sentenced, all of this remains to be seen. The legal process grinds slowly, but the facts remain unchanged. Omar Murray went to work every day building the city's skyline. He went to church every Sunday. He tried to be a good husband, a good father, a good man, and he was murdered by the person who was supposed to love him most. All because she wanted money. All because $900,000 was worth more to her than his life. In the end, this is a story about greed. It's a story about betrayal. It's a story about how love can turn to something dark and cold. How the person sleeping next to you can become your executioner. Omar Murray's daughter grew up without a father. His mother in Jamaica mourned her son from across an ocean. His brother Andrew had to stand in a courtroom and say he thought Alicia loved Omar, had to confront the fact that he had welcomed a murderer into his family. And what did Alicia gain? Nothing. She never got the insurance money. She lost her freedom. She lost whatever reputation she had. For $900,000 that she never received, she threw away her life and took Omar's. There's no neat moral to this story. No lesson that makes it easier to bear. Sometimes people are capable of unthinkable cruelty. Sometimes the person you trust most is the one who will hurt you. Sometimes greed overwhelms every other human emotion. Omar Murray deserved better. He deserved to watch his daughter grow up. He deserved to grow old, to see grandchildren, to retire from his dangerous work and spend his days in peace. Instead, he got 3 bullets in his own doorway, fired by a stranger hired by his wife. Let this story fade as you drift towards sleep. Omar's story is over, but his memory remains, carried by those who loved him, those who knew he deserved justice. And in the end, in some small way, justice was served. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. Tonight, we journey to a place where turquoise waters meet white sand, where palm trees sway in the Caribbean breeze, and where paradise became the setting for a tragedy that would haunt a family for years to come. This is the story of Yvonne Baldelli, a woman who dared to dream of a simpler life, and the man who betrayed that dream in the most unthinkable way. Yvonne Lee Faust was born on the 4th of March, 1970, in Los Angeles, California, to parents James and Emma Faust. She grew up in the warm sunshine of Southern California, surrounded by her siblings, Lorraine, Michelle, and James Jr. From childhood, Yvonne was known for her melodious laugh and her contagious smile, the kind that could light up any room she entered. As she grew into adulthood, Yvonne found her calling in the corporate world. She became a regional sales representative for Procter & Gamble, specifically managing Sebastian Hair and Cosmetics. Her work took her throughout the Los Angeles and Orange County areas, visiting salons to ensure they had adequate product stock. It was demanding work, but Yvonne excelled at it, eventually relocating to the San Diego area to better serve her territory. By 2009, at 39 years old, Yvonne had been through a divorce. She was rebuilding her life, finding her footing again. That's when she met Brian Carl Brimmager at Hennessy's Tavern in Dana Point, California, a seaside town with ocean breezes and the promise of new beginnings. Brian was 34 at the time, a decorated Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton. He'd served 8 years in the Corps, though he'd never seen combat. He presented himself as a man of honor, someone who lived by the Marine motto of Semper Fidelis, always faithful. He was charming, attentive, and he played guitar. To Yvonne, who had always dreamed of being a mother and building a family, Brian seemed like the fresh start she'd been hoping for. Their relationship moved quickly, perhaps too quickly. Yvonne's family had reservations about how rapidly Brian integrated himself into her life, especially so soon after her divorce. But Yvonne was genuinely happy, and eventually her family warmed to him. They wanted to believe in her happiness. They wanted to believe Brian was who he claimed to be. For 2 years they dated. Yvonne continued her work with Procter & Gamble, and Brian continued his service as a Marine. They built a life together in Southern California, where the ocean was never far away and the future seemed bright with possibility. By 2011, life had taken an unexpected turn. Yvonne was laid off from her position at Procter & Gamble, a job she'd held for years, a career she'd built her life around. It was devastating, but it was also liberating in a strange way. Around the same time, Brian's 8-year career in the Marines was coming to an end. They were both at a crossroads, both facing an uncertain future. But what if that uncertainty could become an adventure? Brian had an idea. What if they left everything behind? The corporate pressures, the expectations, the ordinary life, and moved somewhere tropical, somewhere they could live, simply, by the ocean, making just enough to get by. What if they chased a different kind of dream? Yvonne, ever the optimist, embraced the idea with her whole heart. She envisioned herself creating a line of swimsuits to sell to tourists, using her fashion sense and the 2 sewing machines she planned to bring with her. Brian would play guitar and sing in local bars, earning food and drinks while entertaining visitors. They would wake up to the sound of waves, swim in crystal clear water every morning, and live the kind of life most people only fantasize about during their 2-week vacations. They chose Panama, specifically the archipelago of Bocas del Toro on the Caribbean coast. Within this chain of islands lay Isla Carnero, a small remote island accessible only by water taxi or private boat. It was paradise in its purest form. Quiet, beautiful, isolated. In September of 2011, Yvonne sold most of her belongings. She packed her 2 sewing machines, her clothes, and gathered up her most precious companion, her Cavalier King Charles Spaniel named Georgia May. Together she and Brian boarded a plane bound for Panama. They rented a small room in a hostel on Isla Carnero, a simple waterfront dwelling that locals knew as Casa del Sapa. The house had a peculiar history. It had once been owned by an American serial killer known as Wild Bill Holbert, who'd murdered at least 5 American expats and used their online identities to communicate with their families after their deaths. But Yvonne and Brian didn't know this dark piece of history when they moved in. To them, it was just a cheap place to stay while they built their new life. At first, everything seemed perfect. Yvonne sent detailed, joyful emails to her family back in California. She described their daily routines, waking up early to go running along the beach, swimming in the ocean each morning, watching Georgia May splash happily in the surf. She painted vivid pictures of island life, of warm sunshine and simple leckers. "We love it," she wrote to her sister Michelle. "We wake up and go running, then swim in the ocean every morning." Her father James received photos of his daughter looking radiant, tanned and smiling in the tropical sun. Her family felt reassured. Yvonne had found her paradise. She was happy. But beneath the surface of those cheerful emails, something darker was beginning to take root. Brian Brimmager was not the man he'd claimed to be. Almost immediately after arriving in Panama, Brian began sending emails to another woman back in California, the mother of his young daughter, a child Yvonne didn't know existed. In these messages, Brian discussed his plans to return to California and marry this other woman. He never mentioned Yvonne. It was as if she didn't exist. Yvonne, meanwhile, was trying to make their dream work. She had plans to start sewing swimsuits, to build something for herself in this new place. But Brian showed little commitment to their supposed shared vision. He performed at the Cosmic Crab and other surrounding bars a couple nights a week, but locals would later recall that his musical talents were questionable at best. One resident described his singing as sounding like a hound dog on a porch. He could play guitar adequately, but when he opened his mouth to sing, he butchered the songs. Brian spent most of his time drinking rather than working. His performances earned him free drinks more than actual money, and he wasn't bringing in enough to support their lifestyle. The dream was crumbling before it had even fully taken shape. And then the violence began. Witnesses on the island, neighbors, bar patrons, people who'd crossed paths with the couple, would later tell investigators about disturbing incidents they'd witnessed. They'd seen Brian beating Yvonne, punching her, choking her. They'd seen bruises on her arms and around her eyes. They'd heard screaming coming from the couple's home, desperate and frightening sounds that echoed through the tropical nights. 8 separate witnesses would eventually come forward to the FBI, with accounts of Brian's abuse. 8 people who'd seen him threaten to kill her. 8 people who'd watched as the 220-pound ex-Marine brutalized the 110-pound woman who'd given up everything to build a life with him. Yvonne's emails home began to change. They became less frequent. The vivid descriptions of Island Paradise gave way to shorter, more sporadic messages. By Thanksgiving of 2011, just 3 months after their arrival, the communication had slowed to a trickle. Her sister Michelle noticed immediately. Something was wrong. Sisterly instinct told her that the silence wasn't right, that Yvonne wouldn't just stop reaching out this way. But Brian assured everyone that everything was fine. Just busy, he'd say. Just settling in. Then, on November 26, 2011, Yvonne Baldelli was last seen at a local restaurant. She was with Brian. She would never be seen alive again. What happened that night remains known only to one person, Brian Brimmager himself. But through his later confession and the evidence gathered by investigators, we can piece together the horror of Yvonne's final hours. Brian attacked Yvonne in their small room at the hostel. He beat her viciously, breaking her nose and her teeth. Then he stabbed her multiple times in the back with a knife. A kind of betrayal that comes from behind from someone you trust. Yvonne, who weighed barely more than half of what Brian weighed, never stood a chance. The evidence would later show that Brian dragged her lifeless body to the shower. There, in that tiny bathroom, he took a machete, the same one he'd purchased in the United States before moving to Panama, and he dismembered her. He cut her body into pieces small enough to hide. Just hours after committing this unspeakable act, Brian sent an email to a friend. His words were casual, upbeat, completely devoid of remorse. "Hey, bro, what you up to? I got stories for days. I'm living on an island off the coast of Panama, loving life and living semper free. Semper free, a twisted play on the Marine motto, always free, instead of always faithful." Brian stuffed Yvonne's remains into a green military-style duffel bag and several trash bags. Under the cover of darkness, he hiked approximately 1.5 miles through the jungle to a remote, swampy area on another side of the island. There he threw the bags containing Yvonne's dismembered body down an embankment, into dense vegetation where he believed they'd never be found. Then he went back to the hostel and began the cover-up. The next morning, Brian used Yvonne's laptop computer to search for information on how to remove bloodstains from a mattress. When he couldn't figure it out, he simply threw the blood-soaked mattress into the ocean. He gathered up Yvonne's belongings, her clothes, her makeup, her jewelry, her 2 sewing machines, and stuffed everything into approximately 10 large trash bags. He left these bags on a dock near the hostel for disposal. And then he killed Georgia May, Yvonne's beloved dog, her companion, the innocent creature who'd made the journey to Panama with her. Brian killed her too, likely because the dog was a reminder, a witness of sorts to Yvonne's absence. Georgia May's body was never found. Later, Brian would claim he'd also killed another dog that Yvonne had adopted on the island. With the physical evidence disposed of, Brian turned to the digital deception. For the next month, Brian Brimmager impersonated Yvonne online. He accessed her email account and began sending messages to her family and friends. In these emails, Yvonne claimed that she'd discovered Brian had a child back in California, the daughter he'd never told her about. She wrote that she was heartbroken, that the relationship was over. She said she'd met another man, someone named Tony Gonzalez, and that she was traveling with him to Costa Rica to start over. The emails were convincing enough to give Yvonne's family hope. cruel false hope that their daughter was still alive. But they also sowed confusion and delayed the family from reporting her missing for approximately 2 months. Which was exactly what Brian intended. "I'm traveling now," the fake email said. "I need space. I'll be in touch when I'm ready." A few days after murdering Yvonne, Brian accessed her bank account. He withdrew her money. Money she'd saved, money she'd planned to use to build her swimsuit business, and used it to buy drugs and alcohol. He went to local bars and bought rounds of drinks for female friends he was now pursuing. "Thanks, Vonnie," he'd say, raising his glass in a toast to the woman he'd just murdered. He began seeing another woman on the island, Nicole Powell. She would later tell investigators that Brian became violent with her too, hitting her in the face during a visit she made to California. She left him immediately after that incident, frightened by the rage she'd glimpsed. Brian was also making plans to return to California. He sold the machete on Facebook, joking in the post, "I bought it in the States before I moved down there. Don't worry, I only dismembered one stripper with it, so it's hardly used." Troke was real. The machete had indeed dismembered someone, Yvonne, but people who read the post thought it was dark humor. Nothing more. In mid-December, Brian sent a text to Michelle from an unfamiliar number. "This is Brian. May I make arrangements to pick up my truck?" Michelle was stunned. Why was Brian contacting her? Where was Yvonne? She texted back, demanding answers. Brian spun his story. Yvonne had found out about his daughter. She was devastated. She'd met another man and gone to Costa Rica. He didn't know where she was exactly. He just wanted to get his truck and move on with his life. But Michelle's intuition screamed that something was wrong. Yvonne would never just disappear like this. She would never abandon her family, especially not without a phone call or a real explanation. And the idea that she'd run off with a stranger after being heartbroken made no sense for someone whose greatest dream had always been to be a mother. Michelle reached out to a tech-savvy cousin for help. Together, they began investigating the source of Yvonne's recent emails. The cousin traced the IP addresses of the emails purportedly sent by Yvonne. The early messages, the happy ones describing island life, had indeed come from Panama, but the later ones, the emails claiming Yvonne had left for Costa Rica with another man, had originated from Dana Point, California, the same Dana Point where Brian Brimmager was now living. In fact, those Costa Rica emails were coming from Brian's own computer. Yvonne's emails and Brian's emails shared the exact same IP address. The proof was undeniable. Brian had been impersonating Yvonne all along. Michelle's worst fears were confirmed. Yvonne had never left Panama. She hadn't gone to Costa Rica. She hadn't met another man. Brian had done something to her, something terrible, and then he'd lied to everyone to cover it up. In January of 2012, when Yvonne failed to appear at a family reunion, an event she would never have missed, her family filed a missing persons report with Panamanian authorities. By this time, Brian was already living comfortably back in California. And shockingly, just weeks after leaving Panama, he married the mother of his daughter, the woman he'd been emailing throughout his time with Yvonne. Her name was Kristen, and she was a woman with impressive credentials. She'd once held top-secret security clearance and had worked as a White House analyst under President George W. Bush, sometimes even working in the Situation Room. Kristen had no idea who she was really marrying. She believed Brian's story about Yvonne. She believed he was a good man, a decorated Marine, someone honorable. A photographer who captured their wedding photos later described seeing a couple in love, super sincerely happy, just enjoying the day at the beach in La Jolla. They'd arrived for their photo session in a limousine, in their wedding attire, with champagne flowage. It was romantic, beautiful, and built entirely on lies. While Brian was playing newlywed, Yvonne's family was desperately searching for answers. 2 months after filing the missing persons report, Yvonne's family traveled to Panama themselves. They couldn't wait for authorities to move at their own pace. They had to do something. They reached out to Don Winter, a legendary investigator and ex-U.S. intelligence officer living in Panama, who had an uncanny ability to solve murders. Winter had already helped put away 3 serial killers. When Americans in Panama found themselves in trouble, Winter was the person they called. Together with Winter, Yvonne's family began their own investigation on Isla Carnero. What they discovered was chilling. Locals told them about the frequent screaming they'd heard coming from Yvonne and Brian's home. They described seeing bruises on Yvonne's face and arms, They recounted witnessing Brian's violence toward her, his drinking, his failing attempts to make money with his music. Multiple people painted a picture of an abusive relationship, of a woman who'd been trapped in paradise with a dangerous man. The family even searched for Yvonne's body themselves. They combed through swampy, spider-infested jungle areas, terrified of what they might find yet unable to stop looking. They came heartbreakingly close at one point, searching an area that was less than the length of a football field from where Yvonne's remains actually were. But they didn't find her. Not that. While the family was in Panama doing the work that should have been done by authorities, Brian was back in California, living his life as if nothing had happened. He played golf. He went to the beach with his new wife. He acted like a man without a care in the world. In the summer of 2012, CBS's 48 Hours program showed Michelle a video of Brian's new life. Images of him golfing, relaxing, celebrating his marriage. He thinks he got away with murder, Michelle said, her voice steady despite the pain. So what you have here is a person who killed my sister and can walk away scot-free. CBS correspondent Peter Van Sant confronted Brian directly. Cameras rolling. Brian, Peter Van Sant with CBS News. We'd like to ask you a couple of questions. Could you please talk to us? Did you murder Yvonne Baldelli? You can speak to us. You can answer that question. Brian, why won't you speak with us? Did you have anything to do with her disappearance? Brian said nothing. He simply walked away, headed to play another round of golf. But the FBI was watching. They were building their case piece by piece. On June 26, 2013, just 6 days after Brian's wife Kristen gave birth to their second child, the FBI arrested Brian Brimmager. He was charged with 13 felonies related to the cover-up of Yvonne Baldelli's death, though not yet for her actual murder. The charges included obstruction of justice, making false statements to a federal officer, and falsifying records. Assistant U.S. Attorney Hamilton Aranzan addressed reporters at the time, making it clear who they believed was responsible. Mr. Brimmager killed Miss Baldelli and disposed of her body in an unknown location, and then engaged in an elaborate scheme to cover up his crime. Michelle received the news via text from her father. They got the SOB. A sense of relief came over me for a minute. Michelle later recalled, because now they believed us. Brian's arrest was a victory, but it was incomplete. They still didn't have Yvonne's body. They still couldn't prove definitively how she died. Then, 2 months after Brian's arrest, nearly 2 years after Yvonne's disappearance, a Panamanian farm worker clearing brush in a remote swampy area of Isla Carnio made a grim discovery. He found a green military-style duffel bag and 2 trash bags stuffed deep in the jungle vegetation. Inside were skeletal remains. DNA testing confirmed what the family had known in their hearts all along. The remains belonged to Yvonne Lee Baldelli. She had been dismembered, just as investigators had suspected. Her body had been cut apart with the machete. Brian had purchased in the United States and later sold on Facebook with his sick joke about only using it once. You know, how dare he? Michelle said when she learned the truth. He just thought that he could discard her and throw her away like she was trash. And she deserved so much more. In February of 2014, 7 months after his arrest, Panamanian authorities officially charged Brian Brimmager with Yvonne's murder. But there was a problem. Brian was in the United States, and Yvonne had been killed in Panama. Bringing him to justice would require complex international legal negotiations. In April of 2015, after extensive talks between U.S. and Panamanian authorities, the United States agreed to prosecute Brian Brimmager using a rarely used federal law, foreign murder of a U.S. national. This law allows the U.S. to prosecute American citizens who kill other American citizens in foreign countries, provided the accused has since left the country where the crime occurred. It was so rare that it had only been used twice before in federal court history. Brian was indicted by a federal grand jury in San Diego on a charge of first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. The case was heading to trial. But then investigators made one final crucial discovery. The FBI had recovered the machete, the one Brian had sold on Facebook. Special Agent Masters decided to examine it more closely. They unscrewed the handle, removing 3 screws that held it in place, and tested the interior. They found Yvonne's blood and DNA under the handle. This was the slam dunk. This was the physical evidence that made Brian's guilt absolutely undeniable. Within a week of this discovery, in February of 2016, Brian Brimmager changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder while the other charges were dropped. After nearly 5 years of lies, he was finally admitting what he'd done. On May 25, 2016, Brian Brimmager stood before U.S. District Judge Jeffrey T. Miller for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with Yvonne's family and friends, more than 20 people who'd come to speak for a woman who could no longer speak for herself. Prosecutors presented evidence of Brian's behavior in the hours, days, and months following the murder. They showed his semper-free email sent just hours after killing Yvonne. They presented evidence of him toasting with her stolen money, buying drinks and drugs while she lay decomposing in the jungle. They showed the court his social media post joking about the machete he'd used to dismember her. They told the court about 8 witnesses who'd seen Brian beating, punching, choking, and threatening to kill Yvonne during their time in Panama. They described how the 220-pound ex-Marine had broken the 110-pound woman's nose and teeth before stabbing her multiple times in the back. They described how Brian had dragged her lifeless body to the shower and mutilated it, how he'd stuffed her remains into bags and thrown them into the jungle like garbage, how he'd killed her dogs, how he'd stolen her money, impersonated her online, and tormented her family with false hope for months. 9 members of Yvonne's family gave victim impact statements. Her father, James, spoke of the cruel hope he'd clung to when receiving those fake emails, and the pain that would endure for the rest of his life. Her mother addressed Brian directly. "Your life would have been easier if you just sent Yvonne home. You will have to answer to a higher power, and I will never forgive you." Her childhood friend Adrienne Marcus called the crime disgusting and heinous, describing the agony of flying to Panama to help search for her friend's body. Van's niece, Lauren, spoke as one of many voices for Yvonne. Life was much simpler before even hearing Brimmager's name. After he murdered her, he teased the family by acting like he was Yvonne. He has a dark soul. Why did he have to do this and carry it on for so long? Michelle, Yvonne's sister, the one who'd never stopped believing something was wrong, who'd tracked the IP addresses, who'd flown to Panama to search, who'd fought tirelessly for justice, gave a powerful statement. Today we got an apology, a hollow last-minute attempt to save himself. Brian did offer an apology to the family. He turned to face them in the courtroom and said he was sorry. "Don't look at us." Someone fired back. "Sure." Another scoffed. The apology rang empty because his actions had already spoken louder than any words ever could. Judge Miller, considering the evidence of extreme cruelty and Brian's complete lack of remorse, handed down a sentence stronger than a typical second-degree murder term. "This murder was particularly cruel and depraved," the judge said. "The lengths Brimmager went to avoid detection were particularly brazen and ultimately shattering to the Baldelli family. I dare say they will never recover. A day may never go by without them thinking of Miss Baldelli and the horrific murder and the images seared into their psyche." Brian Carl Brimmager was sentenced to 26 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to pay a $10,000 fine and more than $11,000 in restitution to Yvonne's father. "The day of reckoning has come for Brian Brimmager," said U.S. Attorney Laura Duffy. "Not only did he show a callous disregard for Yvonne Baldelli's life by viciously beating, stabbing, dismembering, and dumping her in the jungle, but his words and actions in the hours, days, and months following his horrendous crime exhibited an extreme lack of remorse. He stole a precious daughter, sister, aunt, and friend, and now he is paying the price." With the case finally over, Yvonne's remains were returned to her family. They chose to lay her to rest at sea, a fitting final resting place for a woman who'd loved the ocean, who'd dreamed of waking up to the sound of waves, who'd wanted nothing more than a simple life by the water. Brian Brimmager remains in federal prison. In later years, he attempted to get his sentence reduced, claiming he'd found Christianity and reformed himself. But Yvonne's family saw through this final manipulation. As Michelle said during that hearing, "He's trying to hide behind his Christianity. He's trying to hide behind his Marine service. And we know that Marines have a commitment to honor and respect and duty. This is not a Marine." The judge denied his request for early release. Yvonne's family continues to honor her memory. They remember her melodious laugh, her contagious smile, and her kind heart. They remember a woman who dared to dream of a different life, who had the courage to chase that dream, who deserved so much better than the fate that awaited her in paradise. Jim Faust, Yvonne's father, perhaps said it best when he called Brian Brimmager the ultimate incarnate of evil. Some people wear masks so convincing that even those closest to them can't see the monster underneath. Brian fooled Yvonne. He fooled his new wife. He fooled her family. He was able to live a double life, sometimes a triple life, presenting himself as someone honorable when his actions showed he was anything but. The case of Yvonne Baldelli serves as a sobering reminder that paradise can become prison, that trust can be betrayed in the most unthinkable ways, and that justice, though sometimes slow, can eventually prevail through the persistence of those who refuse to stop fighting for truth. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember Yvonne not for how she died, but for how she lived. With optimism, with courage, with dreams of a better life. Remember the sister who never gave up searching for her. Remember the family that refused to let her become just another missing person statistic. And remember that even in the darkest stories, there are people who fight for justice, who speak for those who can no longer speak, who ensure that the truth, no matter how painful, finally comes to light. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet comfort of your evening, we're going to explore a story that reminds us how fragile and precious life can be. This is the story of Landy Martinez, a young man whose kindness touched everyone he met, and whose final hours would become one of the most haunting cases in Florida's criminal history. There's no rush, no urgency, just a tale that needs to be told, in memory of a life that deserved so much more. This is the story of love, jealousy, and the darkness that can hide in the human heart. December 13th, 1990. A small island nation in the Caribbean, Cuba. On this day, a baby boy came into the world. His name was Landy Martinez. His parents looked at him and saw possibility, saw hope, saw a future filled with promise. When Landy was just 5 years old, his family made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. They left Cuba behind and traveled to the United States, settling in Miami, Florida. It was a new beginning, a fresh start in a country that promised opportunity and freedom. Landy grew up in Miami, surrounded by the warmth of his father and the vibrant energy of a city where cultures collided and merged into something beautiful. He was a sweet child, gentle and kind, with a smile that could light up a room. Those who knew him as a boy remember his compassion, the way he seemed to care about everyone around him. As Landy moved through his teenage years, he began to understand something about himself, something that in some places would have been cause for fear, but in Miami's diverse landscape could be embraced. When he turned 18, Landy made a courageous decision. He came out to his loved ones as a gay man. His family, his friends, they wrapped their arms around him and accepted him for exactly who he was. It was a moment of liberation, a moment when Landy could finally breathe and be his authentic self without apology or shame. After finishing high school, Landy set his sights on a career that matched his natural compassion. He enrolled in training to become a certified nursing assistant. He wanted to help people, to care for those who needed it most, and he excelled. He found his calling. In his early 20s, Landy decided to leave Miami behind and move north along Florida's Gulf Coast to a city known for its acceptance and diversity, St. Petersburg. The city welcomed him with open arms. St. Petersburg had long been known as a safe haven for the LGBTQ community, a place where people could live openly and authentically. Landy found work at a nursing home facility in nearby Tampa. It was perfect for him. Every day he walked into that building and brought joy to the elderly residents who lived there. He wasn't just providing medical care. He was providing companionship, laughter, dignity. His friend Gail Rigg worked alongside him and watched as Landy transformed the lives of the people he cared for. She would later say that Landy was sweet and kind and caring. The residents loved him. He loved the residents. Eventually he became the activities coordinator, planning events and entertainment that brought smiles to faces that had seen too many lonely days. Landy loved his job. He loved his coworkers. He loved the residents. Outside of work, he embraced the nightlife of St. Petersburg, dancing at clubs, making friends, living the life he'd always dreamed of. At 21 years old, Landy Martinez had built a good life, a meaningful life. But he was also a romantic. He wanted to find love, to find someone who would see him and cherish him and build a future with him. And he believed, as so many young people do, that love would find him when the time was right. He had no way of knowing that love would lead him into darkness. The internet has changed how we meet people. In the early 2000s and 2010s, dating apps and websites were becoming the norm, especially in the LGBTQ community, where traditional ways of meeting partners weren't always available or safe. Landy, like so many young people, turned to the internet to find connection. And that's where he met Jose Adam. Jose was charming, charismatic, exactly the kind of person who could sweep someone off their feet with sweet words and romantic gestures. They met online and began talking, and Landy felt that flutter of possibility. Could this be the one? Landy was so excited about this new connection that he drove all the way to Miami to pick Jose up and bring him back to St. Petersburg. It was a grand romantic gesture, the kind of thing you do when you think you found something special. At first, it seemed like the relationship had potential. Jose moved in with Landy. They shared a house, shared their lives. For a few weeks, it was everything Landy had hoped for. But relationships have a way of revealing themselves over time. What seems perfect in the beginning can slowly unravel as the true nature of each person emerges. The relationship between Landy and Jose became volatile. They fought, they argued, over small things and big things, over a vehicle, over money, over the thousand little tensions that can build up when two people try to merge their lives. And then in early December of 2011, it ended. They broke up. Jose moved out of the house they'd shared. Landy tried to move forward. The house Landy lived in was owned by a man named Carlos Flores, who had other tenants as well. After Jose moved out, Carlos took precautions. He installed security cameras. He changed the locks on the front door. Some part of him, some instinct, told him this breakup might not be as simple as it seemed. But Landy was resilient. He was determined to keep living his life, to keep pursuing happiness. He went back to work, back to caring for his residents, back to his friends and his routines. And then he met someone new. His name was Jonathan Galacia. Jonathan was 25 years old, and like Landy, he was looking for love. When they met, there was an immediate connection. They started dating, and within a few weeks, they were spending almost all their free time together. Landy's roommates noticed how happy he seemed, how excited he was about this new relationship. But there was a complication. Jose, even though Jose had moved out, even though the relationship was over, Jose wasn't ready to let go. He still had feelings for Landy, and more than that, he was jealous. Deeply, dangerously jealous. Jonathan could sense it. He knew that Jose was still part of Landy's life in some way, and it made him uncomfortable. He was jealous too. A triangle had formed. Three people connected by desire and insecurity and the complicated emotions that come with love and loss. Landy, wanting to be honest, wanting to clear the air and move forward, decided to do something bold. On the night of December 20th, 2011, he arranged a three-way phone call. Landy, Jose, and Jonathan would all talk together, and Landy would make it clear that his relationship with Jose was completely over. For an hour, the three of them talked. Jonathan stayed quiet, listening as Landy explained to Jose that they were finished, that he was with someone new now, that it was time for everyone to move on. Jose's voice was calm. He agreed. He said he understood. He even mentioned that he had a new boyfriend himself, someone who had bought him a red Lexus. Everything, it seemed, was going to be fine. Everyone could move forward with their lives. When they hung up the phone, Landy and Jonathan felt relieved. The air had been cleared. The complications had been resolved. They could finally start fresh. They had no idea what was coming. The next morning, Jonathan woke up to text messages from Landy. But the messages were strange, unsettling. They said things like, "I miss Jose. I really love Jose. He's the love of my life. I want to be with Jose. I'm breaking up with you. I want to give him a second chance." Jonathan stared at his phone in confusion. Just hours ago, they'd been fine. Landy had made it clear he was committed to their relationship. What had changed? He tried calling Landy. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. Something was wrong. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, a very different morning was unfolding. At approximately 8 in the morning on December 21st, 2011, the 911 dispatcher received a call. The voice on the other end was frantic, terrified, screaming, "Help me, help me! They want to kill me! Hurry up, please! Help me!" The dispatcher tried to stay calm, tried to get information. "What's your address?" "Sir, I need your address." But the caller couldn't answer. He was too panicked, too scared. All he could do was scream for help. "What's your name?" the dispatcher asked. Through the chaos, through the fear, the voice managed to say one word: Landy. Landy Martinez. And then, 2 gunshots. Loud and final, and then silence. The line went dead. The dispatcher immediately tried to call back, but the phone didn't ring. It was as if it had been switched off or destroyed. The problem was the call had come from a cell phone, not a landline. The 911 system couldn't pinpoint an exact address. All they had were the general coordinates from cell tower data, which narrowed the location down to 2 streets in the Laman neighborhood of St. Petersburg. Police were dispatched immediately. Officers began going door to door, asking residents if they'd heard anything unusual. Gunshots, screams, anything. About 40 minutes after that first call, another call came into 911. This time it was a woman. She was worried because she couldn't reach her roommate. His name was Landy Martinez. She tried calling him, and he wasn't answering. She checked the security cameras for their house online, and there was no feed. The cameras weren't working. She gave the dispatcher her address. And when the police checked it against their data, they realized something crucial. The address matched. This was where the first call had come from. Officers rushed to the scene. What they found was worse than they could have imagined. The security cameras had been cut. Someone had deliberately disabled them. The house had been broken into. Inside it was chaos, ransacked, torn apart. The bathroom was destroyed. The shower door had been ripped off its track and lay broken on the floor. On the counter, officers found Drano liquid drain cleaner, a knife, duct tape. The room looked like a torture chamber. And in the bedroom, they found Landy Martinez. He was lying face down on the floor, surrounded by blood. He'd been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the back of the head. Near his body, officers found 2 shell casings from a .380 caliber semi-automatic handgun. The medical examiner would later determine that Landy had suffered far more than just gunshot wounds. He had knife wounds, burns on his eyes and throat from exposure to Drano. Residue on his wrists and ankles showed he'd been bound with duct tape. Landy Martinez had been tortured before he was killed. Detectives stood in that house and tried to piece together what had happened. There were valuables piled near the door, as if someone had been planning to steal them. But the brutality of the crime, the personal nature of the torture, suggested this wasn't about robbery. This was about rage, about revenge. The fact that someone had known where to find the Drano, which was stored in a kitchen cabinet far from the bathroom, suggested the killer knew the layout of the house. This was someone familiar with the space. As officers processed the scene, one of them found something crucial. Hidden under the mattress in the bedroom was a cell phone. Landy's cell phone. They obtained a search warrant to access it, but that would take time. In the meantime, they began interviewing everyone in Landy's life. Landy's roommates were quickly cleared. They'd been out of town on vacation with solid alibis. They were devastated by the news. Detectives learned about Landy's job, his friends, his life. Everyone said the same thing. Landy was kind, gentle. He didn't have enemies. He brought joy to people's lives. But then they learned about his romantic life. About Jonathan Galace. Jonathan was brought in for questioning. He told them about the strange text messages he'd received that morning. Messages that didn't sound like Landy at all. He mentioned the love triangle with Jose Adame, the phone call the night before. The detectives checked Jonathan's alibi. His phone records confirmed he was at his home, over an hour away when the murder occurred. He was clear, but Jose Adame immediately became a person of interest. While waiting for the warrant to access Landy's phone, detectives dug into Jose's background. They learned about the volatile relationship between Jose and Landy, about how Jose had used one of Landy's cars and racked up traffic violations. about how possessive and jealous Jose had been. A week after the murder, with the help of the U.S. Marshal Service, detectives tracked Jose down. He was in North Carolina. They brought him in for questioning. Jose insisted he had nothing to do with Landy's death. He claimed he was in North Carolina when it happened, that he hadn't been anywhere near St. Petersburg. But detectives had been working on something. They'd obtained Jose's cell phone records, and those records told a very different story. Jose's phone had pinged off the exact same cell tower as Landy's phone on the morning of December 21st. At the exact time of the murder, Jose had been in Lauman, in Landy's neighborhood. He had lied. While Jose was being questioned, the search warrant for Landy's phone came through. Detectives finally had access to what would turn out to be the most damning evidence in the case. On that phone was a video that would haunt everyone who saw it. The video showed Landy kneeling in his bathroom. His wrists were bound with duct tape. He was crying, pleading for his life. He was speaking in Spanish, begging someone off camera. "Please," he cried. "Please, I'm sorry. Forgive me, Jose. I beg you. Don't kill me. This isn't Jose's fault. I'm the one to blame. I'm the one who made him this way." The person holding the camera said nothing. The video ended abruptly. Sergeant Robert Snipes of the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office would later say, "In 23 years of doing homicide investigations, this is probably the only case where I saw the video of the victim prior to being murdered." Detectives pieced together what they believed happened. Jose had been torturing Landy in the bathroom, recording it on Landy's own phone. During this time, Jose had also used Landy's phone to send those text messages to Jonathan. The messages claiming Landy wanted to get back together with Jose. At some point, Landy managed to escape. Even with his hands bound, he grabbed the phone and ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind him. That's when he called 911. That's when he screamed for help. But whoever was attacking him broke through the door. In the final seconds before he died, Landy shoved the phone under the mattress, hiding the evidence. Then came the gunshots. During Jose's interrogation, he became physically ill. He wouldn't talk, wouldn't confess, but his reaction told detectives they were on the right track. There was another piece to this puzzle. On the 911 call, Landy had said, "They want to kill me." Not he. They, plural. Jose hadn't acted alone. Detectives interviewed Jose's family members. His cousin Maria revealed something important. Jose had borrowed her mother's car, and he'd taken Maria's 16-year-old brother with him on a drive to Florida. When police searched the car, they found critical evidence. Duct tape that matched the tape used to bind Landy. And most damning of all, drops of Landy's blood on the steering wheel. Jose Adame was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The 16-year-old relative was identified as an accomplice, but was never charged with any crime. To this day, that person's identity remains protected. In 2016, Jose Adame went on trial. The trial lasted 2 days. 2 days in which the jury was presented with evidence that painted a horrifying picture of Landy Martinez's final hours. They listened to the 911 call. They heard Landy's voice, terrified and desperate, begging for help. They heard the gunshots that ended his life. They watched the video from Landy's phone. They saw him bound and broken, pleading for mercy that would never come. They heard testimony from Landy's friend, Gail Rigg, who sat in that courtroom and looked at Jose Adame for the first time. She later said Jose seemed to have no remorse. He just sat there with a blank look on his face, staring off into space. Jose's defense attorneys argued that while Jose was present during the crime, it was actually his teenage nephew who had pulled the trigger. They claimed Jose was not the one who killed Landy. The jury didn't believe it. After 5 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The same day, the judge handed down the sentence. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Jose Adame was 28 years old. Today, Jose Adame is incarcerated at the Wakulla Correctional Institution in Wakulla County, Florida. He maintains that it was his nephew who killed Landy, not him. But unless new evidence emerges or the nephew confesses, the truth of who fired those final shots may never be fully known. What is known is that a vibrant young man, a man who brought joy and comfort to elderly people who needed it most, a man who loved music and dancing and life itself, was tortured and murdered 4 days before Christmas. Landy Martinez was 21 years old when he died. He had been in this world for exactly 21 years and 8 days. December 13th, 1990 to December 21st, 2011. His death was a senseless crime of passion, jealousy, and rage. A reminder that domestic violence can happen to anyone, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. A reminder that love, when it becomes possessive and controlling, can turn deadly. Gail Rigg, Landy's friend and co-worker, has spoken about him many times since his death. She wants people to remember him not for how he died, but for how he lived, for his kindness, his compassion, his genuine love for the people he cared for. The residents at the nursing home where Landy worked lost someone who made their days brighter. Landy's family lost a son. His friends lost someone who made them laugh. And the world lost a young man who should have had decades of life ahead of him, who should have found real love, the kind that lifts you up instead of dragging you down, who should have grown old, caring for others, and being cared for in return. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about Landy Martinez. Not about his final moments, but about his life. About a boy who came to America seeking opportunity. About a young man who found his calling caring for others. About someone who danced and laughed and loved with his whole heart. Remember that behind every true crime story is a real person. Someone who mattered. Someone who was loved. Someone whose absence leaves a hole that can never be filled. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. In the United States, you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 or text START to 88788. Rest well, Landy Martinez. May your memory be a blessing and a reminder to all of us to cherish the people we love while we have the chance. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care.